the archives of colonial racial slavery to visualize the haptic and sonic qualities of phantom Black subjects. He's currently a visiting assistant professor at Boston College and a former Woodstock heir, so we're really excited to have him back. Thank you.
Well, I get the benefit of reflecting on Ashley's thoughts. I feel so poured into, like, from that presentation, and I'm aware of our digital audience, but just some things that I'm thinking about to ground myself and also to ground us in our looking, the looking that we'll go through with my work. I begin speaking about my work with these key terms. And in this present moment, I am really moving through the words phantom, touch, and memory. And to this list, through Ashley, I would add traces, erosion, transubstantiation. So what I'll move through is a sort of brief chronology of how I've gotten into making, where I'm at currently. I'll provide some context of the photographs in this exhibition. And I'll sort of see where I'm guided to as I move through the work. Something that I'm thinking about as well is another condition of our looking is this sort of movement throughout this week of thinking about Juneteenth, thinking about the presence of a national holiday that is a commemorative gesture within the realm of colonial racial slavery, a gesture that is complicated, fraught. This past Monday, I felt really abstracted from myself, and I spent the day photographing or attempting to photograph Juneteenth celebrations, some in my hometown, or not hometown, but the town I live in Massachusetts. And I spent most of my time either in my darkroom or taking walks around parks. And within the day, I entered these ideas about the fictions of race and ethnicity, and the fictions as they're played out across time. One thing I'm carrying from the day is even if I establish race as a fiction, it is still real and felt, like fiction can be real and felt. And so my thoughts are in a kind of like historical imagining right now of 1865 and what the actual reality of that time was within this week, what people were feeling in their bodies. To think about origins, not within that. I'll spend a lot of time in the 19th century, actually, as I talk about these images, but I went to Amherst College. I wanted to be an artist. I took a darkroom class in my first semester and was set on a course, set on a path. I really felt the experience of entering photography as a practice of magic. I was like mesmerized by the darkroom practice. The materiality of photographs was something kind of really unknown to me. As a person, I'm born in '96, and there were cameras and physical photographs in the house, but they were kind of elusive objects, right? Not things that were taken seriously or things that I sort of deeply thought about. And in the first semester in college, you're moving through these kind of stepping out of adolescent phases and stepping into a new self. And during that time, I really began to think about formations of being a racialized body. What is Blackness in the theoretical sense, in a physical sense? What does Blackness mean to me? So I began making self-portrait photographs. And one origin that I began to locate as I was making these images, sort of as a prehistory to the images, are these photographs taken by my grandfather, Frederick. Largely a lot of self-portraits in the 60s. And he passed away when I was a teenager, and we didn't have a very close relationship. But suddenly, as I, am observing myself with a camera, this history starts to come out of my family. They begin to express thoughts around how my grandfather was an, avid photographer beyond being a hobbyist, was really interested in photography. And I began to think about this sort of coalescence of stepping into memories that are floating around you or perhaps not present within you, or present currently within you. I really was, am continually shocked by his need to document himself in particular moments throughout his youth. And at the same time, I'm using the same system of camera that he's using, a twin lens reflex. During this time, I can think about artistic lineage as well. I'm clearly looking at Carrie Mae Weems, Lorna Simpson, Lyle Ashton Harris. I also was thinking a lot about sculptural forms, taking a lot of different classes. And presently, I'm sort of thinking about Martin Purrier, Horace Pippin, and James Traylor. So I was working in these two modes, documenting myself, photographing myself, staging myself, and then creating these kind of still lifes in a studio, looking at objects that were used for painting studies, basic shadow and light drawing, very formalist. But my attraction to certain things felt like a precursor of works to come. And also they felt like manifestations of an interest in history. I was interested in objects that displayed labor or things that felt used, things that felt handled. Thinking with Ashley as well, thinking about the labor a body can enact and hold. I tried to think about, what are the physical materials of Blackness from the land? What do we associate with Black bodies, and how do I relate to them? And in some kind of really direct and didactic ways, I was just applying those materials to my form, photographing it and seeing what happened, seeing my response to it, seeing how I felt like my form changed in relationship to it. I'm primarily a still image photographer. I'm really invested in the still image. I now primarily just shoot with a large format camera, working from one image at a time. But what I feel like I carry into a still image practice are these practices related to somatic dance, sculpture, and installation. And yeah, I really think about what can be implied, what can be taught, what can be displayed in a gesture, in a very simple movement or a minimalist movement. This is an excerpt from a piece that was once a sculpture. This video was projected within a mound of cotton balls. And I constructed these, a sort of full body suit of cotton. As I'm thinking about origins, thinking about, how do I relate to histories not only of the sort of general narrative of slavery, and labor in the United States? What are the personal entry points? Growing up, I had no foundational knowledge of my family's genealogy, where we came from, besides direct, my grandparents and where they had moved from. And at the tail end of my undergraduate experience, I began digging into what we have of our, what we have of knowledge of our family, what is possessed in archives. And in my sort of communion with my grandfather who had passed, I began to speak to my great aunt who lives in Providence, Rhode Island, and she shared with me a correspondence that they had been having over the course of his life, displaying his keen interest in our paternal ancestry. They had been going back and forth as he had moved around the country for jobs and was forming our family, and sharing research, sharing documents, sharing photographs primarily. And he had a very keen interest in our sort of aligned history with the Narragansett tribe in Rhode Island. And he was very interested in digging back to the earliest ancestors that we could find, which were groups of European settlers, colonists, Africans, and Native peoples between Rhode Island and Massachusetts in the 17th century. So my great aunt shared all these documents with me, and at a particular point, she sent out these kind of books where, relatives of the family could go into the it was like a Microsoft document book, and your name would be highlighted and you could trace back, within the research that she had done. And in the sort of earliest form in that document was this figure named Robert Roberts, whose birth date is unknown, but he is my fifth great grandfather on my patrilineal side. And he was a resident of Boston. He was a free man in the 19th century. His origins to freedom are still unknown. But I began to be really interested in this figure because there is this physical evidence of a text that he wrote, the House Servants Directory. This is the frontispiece of the book, which is also displayed on the wall. This is the original typeface of the guidebook that was published in 1827. And at that time, he was a butler, a domestic servant to Christopher Gore, a Federalist living in a suburb outside of Boston. He had a tenure of working there for 2 years, in which he compiled these entries, these directions, this guide. Christopher Gore was a witness on the publication, and that site that he worked in stands today as a preserved historic site in Waltham, Massachusetts. That site is called Gore Place now. The physical house museum, if you've been in historically preserved spaces, you might have some knowledge of what's there. It's styled to appear, as it would in the 19th century during the primary residence of the Gores, and also the primary time period in which Robert Roberts would have lived there. And so I began going to that site, photographing within it, and reading my ancestors' text, sort of unpacking and thinking about, what was in that tome. The text is a guidebook that is split into 2 parts. The first half are lessons around etiquette, behavior, body language that he was narrating to 2 younger men that he knew were entering household service. And then the second half of the book is a list of recipes, household tips, things he had picked up to manage a household. So in thinking about the formation of this work, I was coming into the project really thinking about body language, gesture, and performance. And within the text, I felt like I was hearing this voice guiding me through the space. This work is in the show, you can examine the print. The space was in, particular areas of repair or stasis as a practice through historical preservation. If they encountered, if the archivist encountered something that was period to the home or an interesting artifact, they would leave it in the state that they found it. And so this wallpaper was uncovered underneath a fireplace of a woodblock print depicting devils. In this space, I was thinking about body language, performance, gesture, and thinking about how I could conjure the essence of what my grandfather was dictating without stepping into the role of a reenactor. It felt important to emphasize the kind of separation between him and me within the space, and I think within the photographs, there is an essence of time collapsing or time being doubled, time being mirrored. And I think some of that is you feel through the physical state of the house and through the ways that the Black figure enters and exits, either as shadow, as phantom, as fully visible, but evading recognition. As in this photograph where I am turned away from the camera. And at the time I was really thinking about how do you interact with these objects that are portraying a certain prefabricated image of history, a prefabricated image of what could have happened in the space, and how do I come to gestures that either refute the known story, the imagined story, and point to things, point to histories that are underneath the prefabricated image, thinking about listening, thinking about touch and the haptic. I'm really fascinated by spaces, again, that show traces, that show evidence of objects being used, evidence of time passing, and this door latch is something that I continue to photograph over the year that I spent venturing to the house. And windows and light also became important observations, or I began to look at and imagine and think about light differently. In my grandfather's directory, he begins his lessons at the beginning of the day and moves in a sequence towards the end of the day. And so he begins the day opening the shutters of the home and closing the shutters of the home. And in larger exhibitions, when I've shown this work, it's been, I've attempted to sequence the images in that fashion, in which the shutters would begin by daylight coming in and conclude into evening. So it should be noted are actually not period to what he actually would have worn in the home, but I think that they again function as a doubled image. I think that I understand them to be a gesture that calls to our contemporary understanding of what a butler or household servant wears and looks like. It also calls or conjures the presence of an archivist, a person handling the space with care. in thinking about reading and the voices that have been present in the room, I'm really, this connection between Baldwin and Morrison is something we can expand. But when I really think about my artistic influence and makers that have informed my methodology, Toni Morrison is kind of the central maker that I look to, the central guide that I look to understand art practice, as well as understanding these questions around being a racialized body in the world. Beloved, the 1987 novel, Pulitzer Prize winning, is a text that has become a kind of map for me within making. I believe it functions that way linguistically. I also have these kind of very personal resonances with how she's approaching the history that is unfolding within the novel. I'll read a short passage, just 2 pages from the novel, and I'll give some context, to its content. She's fabulating, she's creating a fiction out of the historic case of Margaret Garner, who escapes from slavery from Kentucky into Ohio. And through the fugitive slave law, she is found by her owner. And when she is discovered, she attempts to kill her 4 children who she escapes with. She succeeds in killing 2 of the children and then is jailed and tried. In the historical case, the case around Margaret Garner was captured in newspapers because abolitionists mobilized around this case. Within a legal act, the question around the verdict of the crime was if Margaret Garner would be tried for theft, the theft of herself and the theft of her children, or if she would be tried for murder. And within the abolitionist position, they were attempting to get her tried for murder, which would signal that she had rightful ownership of her children and herself. And they did not win that case. She was tried for theft and then returned to Ohio. And so Morrison extrapolates from that case a scenario in which that act happens around fictional characters. Before I read a passage that is quite early in the novel and where Morrison invents a term that I feel becomes my methodology, I wanted to just play this clip bringing her actual voice into the room.
You use a lot of memory from ancestors with them in the book, do you not? I mean, do you believe in that? Do you believe that ancestors that you not know can be still coming through us, working through us, and we retain as a memory?
I do now.
Of them. You do now.
I do now. My whole education, was to make sure I didn't believe things like that. And I dismissed all sorts of things that were indigenous in my family, superstition, and the discredited information, the discredited way of knowing that discredited people always have. But when I began to write, that was the place where I had to go. That's where the information was. That's where the images were. That's where the language, the color came in these tales, folk tales, attitudes, the normal, easy acceptance of signs. And then things began to happen that were really quite startling.
This interview is from 1988, a year after the novel was published, and the full interview is available on YouTube. The passage that I'm going to read from, I think, connects to this idea about images coming to you. Where we're at in the novel is that our protagonist, Setha, is beginning to really deal with the events of the past, escaping from slavery, the attempted and successful murder of her children, and her surviving daughter within the novel Denver is approaching their house, which is personified as being 124. And earlier, before this, Morrison writes that Denver regards the house as having a personality. She regards it as a person rather than being a structure. She enters the house. Denver is questioning her mother, who is praying, or appeared to be praying, and she asks, "What were you praying for, ma'am?" "Not for anything. I don't pray anymore. I just talk." "What were you talking about?" "You won't understand." "Yes, I will. I was talking about time. It's so hard for me to believe in it. Some things go, pass on. Some things just stay. I used to think it was my remembering. You know, some things you forget, other things you never do. But it's not. Places are still there. If a house burns down, it's gone. But the place, the picture of it stays. And not just in my remembering, but out there in the world. What I remember is a picture floating around out there outside my head. I mean, even if I don't think it, even if I die, the picture of what I did or knew or saw is still out there, right in the place where it happened. "Can other people see it?" asked Denver. "Oh, yes. Oh, yes, yes, yes. Someday you'll be walking down the road and you hear something or see something going on so clear. You think it's you thinking it up, a thought picture. But no, it's when you bump into a remembering that belongs to somebody else. Where I was before I came here, that place is real. It's never going away. Even if the whole farm, every tree and grass blade of it dies, the picture is still there. And what's more, if you go there, you who never was there, if you go there and stand in the place where it was, it will happen again. It will be there for you, waiting for you. So Denver, you can't never go there, never. Because even though it's all over and done with, it's going to always be there waiting for you. That's how come I had to get all of my children out, no matter what." Denver picks at her fingernails. If it's still there waiting, that must mean nothing ever dies. Setha looked right in Denver's face. Nothing ever does. And so in this dialogue, Toni Morrison enters the word rememory into the novel. And I can remember in the initial times, I clearly annotated and reread this text quite a bit. But it's taken a handful of years to really understand what the term rememory means and why she added the pretext of re onto memory. Where I get to now when I use this term, she's emphasizing that memory is a social action and memory is a shared web, not only contained within yourself, but amongst a community, amongst the people. Memory is imaginative and, it's a verb. It's enacting something. It's not still. It's not in stasis. It's flowing. Within that passage as well, I continue to go back to it for the language around images. There are texts that analyze Morrison's relationship to photography. Her novel Jazz, again, is a fabulation of a fiction out of a James Van Der Zee photograph. But within Beloved, she emphasizes this idea of images, of imagining, of stepping into images, again, that you may not possess, but are floating in the world. And so as I am taking this in this kind of chronology of my life, moving from one institution to the next, from undergraduate to graduate school, and seeking to expand my practice, thinking about the work that I had made within the House Servants Directory, it became clear to me that in New England and in this area, the culture of historic preservation is an industry, is a field, and these stories that I was encountering, or the story that I encountered as a personal story with an ancestor, exist in multitudes, either within my own family or within, a social web of Blackness. I was coming into historical knowledge that there are, this divide that we have between the North and the South, and thinking about colonial racial slavery is, again, something that is a fabrication to preserve a kind of image of the innocent North. But in actuality, the formation of the states is formed through the business of slavery. It is pervasive. It was in every industry, even if people were not owning slaves themselves. So I began to source these stories in public records and archives, and source sites within the region that claim a Black history through preserved space, as a house museum or a historically significant landmark, and I began photographing in and around them. As I began to work on this project, this work that sort of falls under a scope that I call the Rememory Portfolio, or have used the term Rememory to title it, I met Frances. So in the summer of 2021, I was a resident artist at CPW and was photographing up and down the Hudson, and met Frances at historic Huguenot Street, the historic village around here, and she got me access inside the house to make a couple of photographs, and a kernel of what this exhibition was perhaps began in that moment. And I really began spreading myself, just venturing to different parts of the region, venturing to different houses to see what was there, to encounter them. This work I still feel is finding its exhibition form. Something important as I describe it or as we look at it, I don't often name each site and name each history that is present. It feels important to me that the work not become a pedagogical reiteration of what the homes are trying to display. Instead, I am entering them with a critique, but also to observe how the material history is present. And so thinking about, this sort of interest in objects, my figurative work began taking a backseat as I was entering these homes, and I really became obsessed with material still lives, situational, or sculpted, quote unquote. In each site, I had different parameters around what I could and could not touch, and how I could and could not handle objects. And so I think when the work is viewed in its totality, there is, again, a kind of phantom presence of a figure arranging things. It became important to identify objects that signaled the histories that perhaps could be invisible, in still life work. So objects that signaled acts of labor and service are important in this sequence. Within the spaces as well, similar to, and I feel probably very informed by the photograph Devils, my attention was focused on, what are the contemporary problems of the preservation, humidity, melting or evaporating, paint from the ceiling becomes an image that is a portal or an image that, again, can collapse time. And I really, again, was thinking about the sensuality of objects, thinking about the presence of touch. In particular homes, a curator builds a collection, to display the story of the home. Very rarely are there actual, period objects that belong to the space. But even in that fiction, the objects felt so charged to me. Thinking about the evidence of hands on everything is what guided my attention to particular objects, as well as objects that were unfamiliar to me, and again, that conjured histories of the market, histories of labor, histories of how, again, Blackness flowing into material in the presence of this cotton scale became interesting to me. Again, this object is kind of a simple counterweight. A bale of cotton would be hung on one end, and it would be weighed and priced by its opposite side. Spaces in these homes that are important to me are attics and cellars. Often these are spaces where the enslaved people would rest or sleep. And in the sense, like, I felt in the attics and in the cellars, there are these areas where shadow families form. People in close quarters together, either as actual families or disparate families that were mismatched and stuck together. Within this work as well, I feel I am navigating questions around real and imagined violence. I think some of the objects can be read as tools of torture, as in the case with the attic tools, but often they double as tools of sustenance as well, tools for farming, tools for growing. These are installation photographs from an exhibition of the work at the Mead Art Museum, in which I exhibited work from the House Servants Directory and this portfolio with my mentor, Justin Kimball. And in this gallery, in thinking about touch, thinking about sensuality and the haptic, in the center of the gallery, we installed this table with objects that we pulled from our personal archives, our personal collections, and we invited audience members to touch them and handle them. And I think a sense of the haptic is reinforced if, you can feel the coolness, the smoothness of wrought iron, and then move to an image of it, as well as the feeling of wood. And then a sort of engagement through that exhibition that I began thinking about was the presence of sound and the presence of invisible haptics. And this is a suite of pictures that was installed at the RISD Graduate Showcase. And underneath these 5 photographs are 4 recessed speakers. And these speakers looped an hour-long sound piece that I call Room Tone, which are recordings of myself moving through the preserved houses, handling objects, and then also performing quotidian domestic chores around my house, cooking, cleaning. There's a small clip of it. The voice you hear at the tail end of the clip is Hortense J. Spillers, a literary scholar, contemporary of Toni Morrison, still alive today. And within the audio, she narrates, get this moving. She narrates terms around the presence of shadow families, and she makes a distinction between the term body and flesh, and she uses the term flesh to describe the status of the enslaved. And so one engagement in that installation that I'm still thinking about and I'm excited to continue in an exhibition form is that the audience members, again, is being sneaky and watching them like Ashley, but their engagement became something that was frontal or central from looking at the image, and often people would turn their head and place their ear close to the photographs to listen. The piece itself is about an hour long, and there are long moments of ambient sort of brown and white noise within them. And so that movement from the visual to the oral is something I'm still thinking about. I'll move through the sort of last photographs quickly so we can get into the conversation. But I have been continuing to photograph in and around these sites. I wanted to pause on this photograph because this is a landscape photograph taken at the birth site of W.E.B. Du Bois in Great Barrington. And each time I've come out here, I've returned to this site to rephotograph it. These pine trees are experiencing either beetle kill or an ecological shift where the whole expanse of trees around the interpretive site of Du Bois's home are dying. And to me, it becomes a kind of an accidental memorial or a memorial coming through in the land. The system of commemoration or the kind of echo I feel in this space was informed by how the land has been changing over time. Within the houses and in the latter stages of my study at RISD, it became important to, as I called it, like liberating the objects from the home and either with permission or with not, removing them from the preserved state into a raw state. Flowing within this work as well are these black and white photographs. The house image at the beginning displays this, but a system of double exposure where I would photograph myself and render myself as phantom within the camera. And so the photographs become ghostly apparitions, not only because of their visual symbol, but also because my figure is trapped between two images, between two states of time. And so in recent times, I've still been photographing, as I have said, and I've been trying to sort of broaden my scope, um, um, both physically in the making of the pictures, transitioning my lens to a wider lens to take in more space, but metaphorically as well to sort of step into the present in my practice and again look at landscapes, look at spaces that um, act as portals to the past, but may not be designated so, or may not be historically preserved. And these are raw scans that are in process. And thinking about sound, I've been taking field recordings in these sites and have been taking recordings during the action of image making. In a way, it kind of feels like, I'm approaching a filmmaking practice, but stripping it to its bare parts. Something guiding me or mapping me through space now are sites of public commemoration monuments. Thinking about Kelly's practice now, but it's a Sojourner Truth statue in Florence, Massachusetts. And this image is a photograph of a Morrison bench in the early 2000s, organization called the Toni Morrison Society, which is a group of scholars. Toni Morrison didn't form the society herself, but they formed to create these academic conferences around her work to publish papers. And as a fundraising, but also a commemorative gesture, they have been producing these benches and placing them at sites of either sites that claim Black history, notable sites, unknown sites. I believe there are 25 benches placed now, majority in the United States, some overseas. And the process of acquisition of the benches, you can just purchase them. You do you submit an application, to advocate for the site, but they're a direct purchase. And something that I've been dealing with and thinking about them, my engagement with them takes me to sites that are important. But then I think the benches don't function in the way that they're perhaps intended to. It feels like a kind of a misreading of Morrison's language to me. Get to the end of these works and talk about some recent portraits and one work that's behind this projector. So in addition to these I think sort of photographs that are produced through wandering, through walking. I've been trying to intentionally make figurative work of Black Americans in space. Portraiture in between landscape, but it's so important to perhaps step away from metaphor and point to something directly. This is a photograph made in Detroit. This is in Syracuse, New York. It's a self-portrait in Concord. And something that I think I'm leading to, or this image has become a guide. I'm seeking to combine this practice of portraiture with the sort of elements or lessons that I've learned from still life object handling. This is a photograph of my parents in Detroit in our home. I'll end there. This is the last slide. I have like a lot of questions to the form, but I'll let Frances guide us. Thanks.
Let's take like a few minutes, we can reset, so we can set up for the Q&A. We just shut today.
Testing. Thank you all for coming. Thank you all for taking the time tonight to meet the artists and to listen to this post-talk conversation. My name is Frances. I curated this show, and I'm just so grateful both to CBW and to the artists for agreeing to be a part of it. I'll share a little bit about myself. And I was told by Sarah to do a little plug this weekend, so I'll get that out of the way. In my other job, I work for an Indigenous arts organization called Forge Project. I am the editorial projects manager there, but I also, as Jonathan alluded to, I have a history of working in historic house museums. I've also worked in editorial publishing, and I mention these things because they really have a lot to bring into how I think about art, how I think about putting art together, and the research that I do when I learn about artists and write about art. And just to let you all know, if anyone's interested, Forge Project is part of a show that's opening this weekend called Indian Theater on art and performance in the self-determination era since 1969. So this weekend, if you can all join us there, you'll see me again, and maybe even some of the artists if they decide to come back. But anyway, let's get to the conversation. I'm glad that each of the artists brought up authors and their own research in their work, because I also wanted to give a little bit of context and framing in terms of how I have thought about their work over the years that I've known them. And to me, the best way in to Ashley and Jonathan's work has been through this concept called critical Black memory. And it is a idea that was coined maybe by the scholarly Rayford. And I like to use it to better understand how photography, how Black photographers and Black artists who use photography answer back or maybe look critically at these violent histories. And I'll just read from the abstract of Rayford's journal, but part of that argument is that Black engagements with photography as a site of memory suggest a mode of historical interpretation in which African Americans simultaneously critique the truth claims of photography while they mobilize the medium's documentary capacity to intervene in the classification and subjugation of Black life. And so thinking about this idea of critical Black memory, and since both of you use specific geographic locations to map or remap histories of violence, or as Jonathan mentioned, maybe even violent erasures, I want to start by asking you both, how do you understand your chosen photographic interventions or critical looking or even, rememorializing as a way to remap or replace Black people or the Black subject in historical space? I have to pass this around. So anyone who'd like to go first?
I mean, maybe I can form this an answer to that question in the anecdote that I was sharing about the Juneteenth events. I think, I think our psyches, our personality, our beings are informed by space, are shaped by the landscape, shaped by architecture. I think we map our imagination onto the landscape and architecture. And I feel like I have the belief, and sometimes I think I feel this in my body, that the Black figure evades capture, even in its visibility. And so photography, I think, is fraught historically because of this effect or this kind of presence. And I don't know. I think there are some kind of like muddy waters in photography and in this idea of replacing, repairing, or remapping. Yeah, those are some first initial thoughts.
That's a good question.
Take your time with it. You can come back to it too.
I'm not sure I have anything to add right now. Yeah, maybe let's circle back.
Okay,
I'll think about it.
absolutely. I have notes on my phone and written, so I'll be going back and forth. And actually, maybe this speaks a little bit closer to your work, Ashley. But in terms of this idea of replacing Black life in historical space, how does that, or how do you, either of you, see that affecting maybe contemporary assumptions about Black people taking up space today or now? And this could be, in terms of this idea of Juneteenth celebrations and how, we memorialize these types of events and giving space over to, Black people to experience joy and to look back on significant events, but also just thinking about, in terms of violence against Black lives, like this idea of Black people being able to, live their lives without fear of violence and taking the subway, being in a public space, any of these assumptions. And this is sort of speaking, Ashley, to your reference to Baldwin about, assumptions about Black life in the social arena.
Yeah, I think one of the things I think a lot about, especially, I'm glad you brought up Juneteenth, because this was one of the first Juneteenths that I've spent like among the Black community. And so it was really an interesting experience for me to be kind of in that arena for one of the first moments of my life, and to be able to like fully enjoy that. And to not be bothered, and to be able to actually take up space. And to me, and for my work, I want it to be able to take up space, and for there not to continuously be this fear or this like paranoia of taking up too much space. Yeah, do you have anything?
I guess I'm just thinking about, not to keep talking about the experiences of that day, but to see, like, to be, again, it's the presence of double consciousness, like in the Du Boisian sense, like, I went into one block party that, was in a neighborhood where Black families live, and they were actively celebrating. And my perception of that moment is that, it was a genuine moment of solidarity between neighbors and people in community. And then in other exchanges, I was walking through a park that, was populated by people having a day off and like having picnics, and being gazed at by like white people, just like, it's your day. There's a kind of imagining of like what that day, meant for a Black person sharing space with someone. And I also think just in, the arena of this exhibition, there's something about photographs, again, that's still fraught in this like space of like photographs enact and refuse presence. It was deeply moving in your presentation to see the before and after of the alterations of your work. I might take us into a tangent of just asking you how it felt to share those as well. It feels apt and like within the question Frances asked.
Yeah, I mean, this is the first time I've publicly shared those images, so it feels, I'm also very like cautious of how I show the final images. Like I only ever want them to be shown in installation form. So in the frame, it's never just the digital image, which Frances was very good at. I appreciate that. But so, to me, part of my practice is also being really cautious of trying not to re-traumatize. And so part of me never wanting to show those original images is for that reason. And so I think when those crime scenes or memorials are still in that photo, in the photos, it still kind of alludes back a lot quicker to the original trauma. And so for me, that's like going against what I've like built my practice around. And so it feels, yeah, I don't know. I'm gonna think about it because I think there's I mean, also, I'll just also say this. I think this talk for me was very interesting because I haven't talked about like photo-based work in so long, because it's not the primary part of my practice anymore, even though it's where my practice started. So even kind of just like being kind of in this realm of photography feels really uncomfortable for me as well. I know I'm really going on a tangent. I'm gonna take up all the space. But yeah, that it's been a really interesting, I think, kind of long time. Like we've worked on this exhibition for a while. And so it's really made me think about like this work in a lot of different ways that I kind of never really thought about in the context of my other work.
Just follow up.
Please, go
Sorry,
ahead.
Frances.
No,
but
conversation.
I just wanted to think again about this like idea of slowing down the read of violence and not creating an image or putting an image into the world that reenacts a system of violence, even if it is imagined. And within my work, I feel like I deal with this again in the presence of reenactors, quite literally, and how do you refute the language of the reenactor? But then I also feel like there's a kind of impossibility in, I guess, guiding a viewer's interpretation of violence. And yeah, there's just something there I want to think with you about, like, or I'm like looking to you for guidance. But maybe Frances, you can tether us back.
No, actually, that brings up something I've been thinking about, or I was thinking about, especially during both of your presentations, and that's this idea of sort of embodying this, either the trauma or the violence, in order to have empathy or to receive sympathy. And I've thought, you mentioned earlier that I worked at a historic house museum, and I think a lot about how history museums function in our society and our culture. And there's this funny version of a history museum called a memorial museum, the 9/11 Memorial Museum, but there's also like the Legacy Museum. on racial terror, lynching, on mass incarceration, and there's a lot of people really appreciate its existence, but there's also a lot of criticism on this idea of guiding the visitor through the space in a certain way and promoting a certain narrative on these topics in order to have or to solicit a certain emotional response. And thinking about what you were saying with the white people in the park during Juneteenth, the question I always ask myself in any of the work I do is like, who is this for? And I'm curious in terms of like your audiences, who have you made this work for previously, and have you hoped for a certain emotional response from it?
This is always, this question used to drive me crazy in grad school, because we could ask it all the time. And I think there's two answers. And so I think part of my work is for people of white, in this interesting way to sort of enter this trauma, this injustice against Black bodies in a way that isn't through the media. And so I've always kind of had that in the back of my mind. Also because, so I'm African American, but I'm also white. And so when I think about my practice, I often think about my white family. And I'm like, okay, so this work is also for them in a lot of ways. And so a lot of my previous work dealt more with like historical traumas. And so, and when I was making that work, I was really kind of thinking about them. And so there's been this like interesting kind of shift just within my family realm of like, first of all, like talking about art in my family is like non-existent. That's step one. But then talking about like Black history has been also really interesting because, but the work that I'm doing makes them or allows them kind of to enter that topic in a more comfortable way. And so they definitely have like grown and started asking me questions more than they have in the past. And so I guess that kind of just that little nudge with my family has also kind of inspired me to keep doing this work. But I also think that the work is for the Black community in a way to memorialize and kind of read, like I said, and I think I said this in my talk, but like change the narrative of a lot of these victims that get negatively portrayed in the media.
I was nodding in deep agreement and asking for the mic. I mean, I think I come to it in a really similar place, and I feel like as a person that's becoming an educator, stepping to the role of an educator more, I'm in a turning point where the work still feels like it, the practice is self-invention, like the practice is self-formation. As you were describing sort of the action of memorializing, changing the narrative, the words of like Jamaica Kincaid like flew into my head, and in one of her memoirs, she says that the action of writing about her life saved her life. And there's something in the action for me in photographing, like it helps me move through the world. It is an action for survival, as well as resistance. And I feel like the audience, and something I noted as you were speaking as well, there is an audience of the dead that I'm making the work for.
I'm noticing our time. I'll ask one final question, and then I'll open it up to anyone else. Does that sound good? So, Ashley, you had mentioned that you took a break, and you're in the midst of your break still. It's an ongoing break, and I do, as someone who also works for an arts organization, we have many conversations about how best to support working and living artists today, and not necessarily their legacies or certainly like secondary markets or anything like that. And being at CPW, a place where they have an artist in residency program and have a commitment to supporting artists, and even thinking about your final question about making work that depicts Black joy or Black excellence, or even Black futures. Like I've been thinking a lot about this idea of future history. What can institutions, individuals, organizations do to better support Black artists now, so that they can have the space to create in the way that they really want?
So I'm going to take this from two angles. I'm going to take it from the angle of the artist and then also the angle of the employee. Because I do think working for an arts organization, I do think there's also a moment to create space for artists who work for art organizations to explore their practice and make time for them to explore their practice within their 9-to-5 responsibility. I think it's really hard to kind of, say we're an artist run or any other space is an artist run organization, but then not create that space to allow employees to kind of be creative and pursue your practice. So and I think that goes across the board, whether you're, it doesn't matter if you're POC or not. I think that's just one avenue that I would like to see kind of have more space and time within being a working artist. And then aside from that, I think also just time and space. And the care. I don't really know what that looks like, but understanding kind of the emotional labor that goes into a lot of our work, and creating that space of care and resources for artists of color.
I think we don't have the time to get into the economic answer to that question, but I think just what I'll the thought that I had is, thinking about those terms, Black joy, Black love, Black excellence. I believe it's in Christina Sharp's most recent book, Ordinary Notes, where she says Black excellence is a response to a racist question, right? The drive towards excellence, the ambition towards rising to the top is a response to a racist question. And I think we've been in a place for the past decade where people have used the term Renaissance to describe the emergence of Black artists in the public sphere, in larger museum exhibitions, Venice Biennale, international art showcases, art fairs. And I think that the term Renaissance is a European canonical term. I think it's not accurate to where makers are. I think it forecloses the work of artists within the 20th century. I think the presence and visibility of Black artists on a national scale over the past 10 years is not equivalent to the Western canon. And so my answer to the question is like, give Black artists more space, time, more exhibitions, more presence, more visibility.
Thank you. Before we end, any questions from the audience? Otherwise, we can have some more coffee and and you can come up to us afterward. I'll just say Ashley has books here for sale. If you haven't picked up our small brochure we put together for the show, please do. And please be sure to check out all of the artist works on view. Thank you, Jonathan and Ashley, so much. I appreciate you coming back out to do this, and thank you all for coming.